My name is Roger and I'm 60 years old. I've lived my entire life on a farm in Texas, working the land that my grandfather bought back in 1943. My wife Julia has been by my side for 35 years of marriage. I thought I knew her like the back of my hand, but oh boy was I wrong about that. It was a scorching July day in East Texas, the kind where the heat shimmers off the asphalt like water and the air feels thick enough to swim through. I was driving my beloved John Deere tractor across the back 40, checking on the corn that was finally starting to show some decent height after the late spring rains we'd had. The diesel engine hummed its familiar tune, and I was actually feeling pretty good about life in general. We'd had a good year so far. The cotton was looking healthy, the cattle were fat and happy in the east pasture, and Julia had been talking about maybe taking a vacation to see our daughter Sarah and her kids up in Dallas. After 35 years of marriage, 3 kids and 5 grandchildren, life seemed to be settling into a comfortable rhythm. But the real shock was waiting for me just around the corner. As I rounded the bend near our neighbor David Miller's property line, I could see his red pickup truck parked right up against our fence. Nothing unusual there. David and I had been neighbors for over 20 years, and he often stopped by to chat about crop prices, weather patterns, or just to shoot the breeze about local high school football. He was a good enough neighbor, kept his property neat, and his wife Linda always brought over a casserole when someone in the area was sick or had a death in the family. David was about 15 years younger than me, and still had that lean build that comes from hard physical work. He'd taken over his daddy's farm about 10 years back when the old man passed from a heart attack. Linda and Julia got along well enough, though they weren't what you'd call close friends. More like the kind of acquaintances who wave at each other at the grocery store and exchange pleasantries at church on Sundays. I was planning to stop and say hello, maybe ask him about those new hybrid corn seeds he'd been experimenting with, when I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. But what I witnessed next changed everything. There, right by his truck, clear as day in the bright Texas sunshine, was my wife Julia locked in a passionate embrace with David Miller. This wasn't some innocent peck on the cheek or a friendly hug between neighbors. This was full-blown passion, the kind of kiss you see in romance movies, with his hands tangled in her hair and her arms wrapped tight around his neck. Julia was wearing that blue sundress I'd bought her for her birthday last month, the one that made her eyes look even brighter than usual. Her graying brown hair was catching the sunlight, and for a moment she looked like the young woman I'd married all those years ago. But she was kissing another man with the kind of intensity that made it clear this wasn't their first time. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. The steady rumble of the John Deere engine faded to background noise, and all I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. 35 years of marriage, 35 years of sharing a bed, raising children together, building a life from nothing, and this is what it had come to. But the real surprise was what I did next. Rage flooded through me like wildfire through drought-stricken grass. Every rational thought fled my mind, replaced by a primal fury that I'd never experienced before in my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white, and before I could even think about what I was doing, I slammed the John Deere into high gear and aimed it straight at David's property. The chain-link gate that separated our properties didn't stand a chance. The massive tractor hit it at about 15 miles per hour, and the metal links exploded like confetti in a tornado. The posts bent and twisted, and the whole section of fence collapsed in a twisted heap of metal and wire. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. David's shiny red Ford F-150, the one he bought brand new just 6 months ago and was still making payments on, was parked right behind where the gate used to be. The John Deere's massive rear tires, each one weighing more than most compact cars, rolled right over the front end of that truck like it was made of cardboard. The sound was incredible. Metal screaming against metal, glass shattering like ice in a blender, the crunch of plastic and chrome being compressed into unrecognizable shapes. The truck's alarm started blaring, adding its electronic shriek to the symphony of destruction. Julia and David jumped apart like they'd been struck by lightning. Julia's face went white as a sheet, and she started screaming something I couldn't make out over the noise of the tractor and the truck alarm. David just stood there with his mouth hanging open, watching his pride and joy get turned into an expensive pile of scrap metal. I brought the John Deere to a stop right on top of what used to be the truck's engine block, shut off the ignition and climbed down from the cab. My joints protested. 60 years of farm work will do that to a man's body, but the adrenaline coursing through my system made me feel 20 years younger. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. I started walking toward David with every intention of showing him what we do to men who mess around with other men's wives in rural Texas. My fists were clenched and I could feel the muscles in my shoulders bunching up like a bull ready to charge. David must have seen the look in my eyes because he started backing away, his hands up in front of him in a defensive gesture. "Now Roger, let's just calm down and talk about this like civilized men," he stammered, but I could hear the fear in his voice. Julia was still screaming, though now it sounded more like she was trying to get my attention rather than just expressing shock. I'd made it about halfway between the wrecked truck and where David was standing when the sound of a police siren cut through the chaos. The red and blue lights were already visible coming up the county road, and I realized that Sheriff Thompson must have been patrolling nearby when he heard the commotion. This was about to get very interesting indeed. Sheriff Bob Thompson had been law enforcement in our county for almost as long as I'd been farming. He was a fair man, not quick to jump to conclusions, but he didn't tolerate nonsense either. He'd seen enough domestic disputes and neighbor feuds to know trouble when he saw it, and this situation had trouble written all over it in letters 10 feet tall. The patrol car pulled up with its siren wailing and lights flashing, and Sheriff Thompson got out with that deliberate, unhurried pace that experienced lawmen develop. He was a big man, probably 6'3" and carrying about 250 pounds, with graying hair under his campaign hat and eyes that had seen just about everything humans could do to each other. Well, he said, taking in the scene, the destroyed fence, the flattened truck, and 3 adults who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation here. Roger, you want to tell me what happened?" But before I could open my mouth, Julia rushed over to David and started whispering urgently in his ear. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but whatever it was seemed to have a powerful effect on him. His expression went from fear to confusion to something that might have been resignation. The most unexpected twist was yet to come. After about 30 seconds of Julia's urgent whispering, David straightened up and looked Sheriff Thompson right in the eye. "Sheriff, this was just an accident," he said, and I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Roger's tractor had some kind of mechanical failure, and he couldn't stop it in time. Nobody's fault, really. These old machines, you know how they can be. Sheriff Thompson's eyebrows went up so high they nearly disappeared under his hat brim. He walked slowly around the destroyed truck, taking in the extent of the damage, then looked at the flattened fence and finally turned his gaze back to the 3 of us. "Mechanical failure," he repeated slowly like he was tasting the words. "Roger, that what happened here? Your John Deere just went haywire all by itself." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. David was giving me an out, probably because Julia had convinced him that pressing charges would mean their affair would become public knowledge. In a small town like ours, that kind of scandal could destroy reputations and marriages alike. "Yeah," I finally said, the word feeling like sawdust in my mouth. Throttle stuck open. Couldn't get her stopped. Sheriff Thompson looked back and forth between the 3 of us, and I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what had really happened. But if the victim wasn't pressing charges and everyone was sticking to the same story, there wasn't much he could do from a legal standpoint. But the real consequences were just beginning. "All right then," Sheriff Thompson said after a long pause. "David, you sure you don't want to file a report about your vehicle? Insurance company's probably going to want to see some paperwork." David shook his head quickly. "No sir, no need for that. Like I said, it was just an accident. Roger and I are neighbors. We'll work it out between ourselves." The sheriff made a few notes in his little black book, took down everyone's insurance information, and finally got back in his patrol car. But before he drove away, he rolled down his window and called out, "Roger, you might want to get that tractor checked by a mechanic. Wouldn't want any more mechanical failures." As the patrol car disappeared down the county road, the 3 of us stood there in awkward silence. The truck alarm had finally stopped blaring, leaving only the sound of steam hissing from the ruptured radiator and the occasional tick of cooling metal. Julia was the first to speak. "Roger, don't," I cut her off, my voice harsher than I'd ever used with her before. "Don't say a single word. We're going home. Now." The drive back to our farmhouse, which was only about half a mile away, felt like it took hours. Julia sat in the passenger seat of my pickup. We'd have to come back for the John Deere later, staring out the window with tears running down her cheeks. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. But the real confrontation was waiting at home. Our farmhouse was a modest 2-story structure that had been built in the 1960s when my father decided to expand beyond the original homestead. It wasn't fancy, just white clapboard siding, a metal roof, and a wraparound porch where we'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset over the cotton fields. But it was home, or at least it had been until about an hour ago. The moment we walked through the front door, the dam burst. All the rage and hurt and betrayal that I'd been holding back came pouring out like water through a broken levee. 35 years. I shouted, my voice echoing through the house. 35 years, Julia? 3 children, 5 grandchildren, a life built together from nothing, and this is how you repay me. Julia sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her face in her hands. Roger, please let me explain. Explain what? How you been sneaking around behind my back with David Miller? How long has this been going on, Julia? Weeks? Months? Years? The questions poured out of me like machine gun fire, each one hitting her like a physical blow. She flinched with every word, but I was past caring about her feelings. The woman I'd loved and trusted for more than half my life had betrayed me in the worst possible way. But I was just getting started. I called our 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Jessica. Michael was 33, married with 2 kids of his own, and worked as a supervisor at the grain elevator in town. Sarah was 31, lived in Dallas with her husband and 3 children, and taught elementary school. Jessica was the baby at 28, recently married and working as a nurse at the county hospital. It took about an hour for all 3 of them to get to the house. Michael lived closest, only about 10 minutes away, and he arrived first with a worried expression on his face. Sarah had to drive down from Dallas, which took her about 2.5 hours, and Jessica had to get coverage for her shift at the hospital. When they were all assembled in our living room, the same room where we'd celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings and graduation parties, I told them everything. I watched their faces go through the same progression of emotions I'd experienced: disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a kind of numb acceptance. The most heartbreaking moment came next. Sarah, who had always been Daddy's little girl despite being a grown woman with children of her own, started crying. Mom, how could you do this to Dad? To our family? I don't understand. Jessica, usually the most diplomatic of our 3 children, just sat there shaking her head. This is like something out of a soap opera. I can't believe this is happening to our family. Michael, who had inherited my temper along with my stubborn streak, was the most direct. Mom, what the hell were you thinking? Julia tried to defend herself, but her explanation sounded hollow even to me. She claimed it was just a moment of weakness, that David had kissed her and she'd been too shocked to push him away immediately. She swore it was the first time anything like that had ever happened, that she'd never been unfaithful before. But I could see the doubt in our children's eyes. If she could lie to me for who knows how long, how could they trust anything she said now? However, the real shock came with what she said next. It wasn't what it looked like, Julia insisted, her voice getting higher and more desperate. David kissed me, yes, but I was about to push him away when you showed up, Roger. You just saw it at the wrong moment. I never wanted this to happen. The more she talked, the angrier I got. Did she really think I was stupid enough to believe that? The way she'd been holding him, the passion in that kiss, that wasn't a woman being taken by surprise. That was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. So it's my fault for catching you? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I should have called ahead to make sure I wasn't interrupting anything? Our children sat there in uncomfortable silence, not knowing what to say or do. This wasn't something they'd ever expected to deal with. In their minds, their parents were the stable ones, the couple that other people looked up to as an example of a lasting marriage. But my plan for revenge was already forming in my mind. That night, after the children had gone home and Julia had retreated to the guest bedroom, there was no way she was sleeping in our bed. I sat on the porch and thought about what I wanted to do. The destroyed truck wasn't enough. David Miller needed to learn that there are consequences for messing with another man's wife, and I needed to make sure he never came near my family again. I had one advantage that most men in my situation didn't have. I knew David's weakness. About 5 years ago, he'd been stung by a bee while helping me repair a section of fence between our properties. What should have been a minor annoyance turned into a medical emergency when he went into anaphylactic shock. The ambulance had to rush him to the county hospital, where they pumped him full of epinephrine and kept him overnight for observation. Ever since then, David had been terrified of bees. He carried an EpiPen everywhere he went, and I'd seen him literally run away from a single honeybee that had gotten too close to him while he was working in his garden. And I just happened to own a beekeeping operation. The irony was too perfect to ignore. I'd gotten into beekeeping about 10 years earlier, partly as a hobby and partly as a way to supplement our farm income. Honey prices had been pretty good, and bees are excellent for pollinating crops. I'd started with just 5 hives and gradually expanded to 20 over the years. My beehives were located in the south pasture, far enough from the house that they wouldn't bother Julia but close enough to the property line that David could probably hear them humming on quiet days. I'd always been proud of my bees. They were gentle, productive, and made some of the finest wildflower honey in the county. but now they were about to become instruments of justice. The next morning, David showed up at my front door bright and early. He looked like he hadn't slept a wink, with dark circles under his eyes and his hair sticking up in odd directions. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from nerves or caffeine I couldn't tell. "Roger," he began, his voice carefully measured, "I think we need to talk about what happened yesterday. Clear the air, you know? We've been neighbors for a long time, and I'd hate for this to ruin our friendship." Friendship? The man had been kissing my wife and he wanted to talk about friendship? But what came next was even more audacious. "Look," David continued, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a schoolboy called into the principal's office, "I know you're probably pretty upset about what you saw. But maybe we could just forget about the whole thing and move on. Water under the bridge, you know?" I stared at him for a long moment, trying to decide if he was really that clueless or if he was just hoping I was that stupid. Either way, his next words sealed his fate. "There is one favor I'd like to ask though," he said, glancing nervously toward the south pasture where my beehives were located. "You know about my allergy to bee stings? It's gotten worse over the years and my doctor says the next sting could kill me. Would it be possible for you to move your beehives a little farther away from my house? Maybe to the north pasture instead?" The audacity of it took my breath away. He'd been carrying on with my wife, and now he wanted me to rearrange my farming operation for his convenience? I looked him straight in the eye and gave him my answer, "No. I can't do that." His face fell, but he tried one more time. "Roger, please, I'm asking as a neighbor." "We're not neighbors anymore," I cut him off. "Neighbors don't do what you did. Now get off my property." But my real revenge was already in motion. That same afternoon, I spent 3 hours on the internet researching commercial beekeeping suppliers. I'd always been pretty comfortable with computers, you have to be these days if you want to run a modern farm, but this was the most intensive online shopping session of my life. I ordered 200 additional hives and 200 queen bees from suppliers in Georgia, Florida, and California. I specifically requested the most aggressive breeds available, Africanized honeybee queens that would produce colonies known for their territorial behavior and quick-to-anger temperament. The total cost was just over $15,000, which was a significant chunk of our savings, but I considered it an investment in justice. Besides, if my plan worked the way I hoped, the increased honey production would pay for itself within a couple of years. The delivery trucks started arriving the following Monday. And that's when David Miller's real nightmare began. Installing 200 additional beehives is no small undertaking. I hired my nephew Tommy and 2 of his buddies from the high school football team to help with the setup. We spent the better part of a week positioning the new hives along the entire length of the property line that bordered David's land. By the time we were finished, I had 220 active hives arranged in neat rows, each one humming with the activity of 50,000 to 80,000 bees. The sound was incredible, like a massive generator running constantly in the background. But the sound was nothing compared to the sight of them in action. Honeybees typically forage within a 3-mile radius of their hive, but they prefer to stay closer to home if possible. David's property, with its flower gardens, fruit trees, and the small pond he built for his grandchildren to fish in, was like a bee paradise. Within 48 hours of the new colonies being established, David's backyard was swarming with bees. The first sting happened on a Wednesday morning. I was drinking my coffee on the front porch when I heard David's back door slam open and the sound of him cursing loudly enough to scare the cattle in the next pasture. Through the trees that separated our properties, I could see him running toward his house, swatting at the air around his head. He'd apparently tried to get his morning newspaper from the mailbox and encountered a group of my bees who had decided that the flowering bushes along his driveway were prime real estate for nectar collection. The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later. I found out later from Linda's sister, who worked as a dispatcher for the county emergency services, that David had been stung 3 times on his left arm and once on his neck. The EpiPen had done its job, but his doctor wanted him transported to the hospital for observation as a precaution. But this was just the beginning of his troubles. Over the next few weeks, David's life became a daily battle with my bees. Every time he stepped outside his house, he encountered them. They were in his garden, around his truck, near his mailbox, and clustered around the outdoor air conditioning unit that cooled his house. He tried everything he could think of to discourage them. He bought commercial bee repellent and sprayed it around his property, but it only seemed to make them more aggressive. He installed yellow bug zapper lights, thinking they might attract the bees away from the areas where he needed to walk, but bees aren't attracted to artificial light the way other insects are. Linda started doing all the outdoor work, checking the mail, watering the garden, feeding their dogs. But even she couldn't be everywhere at once, and David still had to venture outside occasionally. The second ambulance call came on a Friday afternoon when David tried to mow his grass. The vibration and noise of the lawn mower apparently angered a group of bees that had been working on the clover in his yard, and they attacked en masse. This time he got stung 7 times before he could make it back to the house and get his medication. But the third incident was the most serious yet. It happened on a Sunday morning when David and Linda were trying to leave for church. A swarm of my bees had decided that the flowering crabapple tree right next to David's driveway was the perfect place to set up a temporary collection point for nectar. David made it about halfway to his truck before the bees noticed him. This time the attack was more coordinated and more vicious than before. By the time Linda managed to get him back into the house and call 911, he had been stung 12 times and was going into severe shock. The paramedics had to use 2 EpiPens and start in 4-line before they could even get him stabilized enough for transport. He spent 3 days in the intensive care unit at the regional medical center, and the doctors told him that another attack like that could be fatal. When David got home from the hospital, he was a changed man. Gone was any pretense of neighborly civility or attempts to work things out between us. David was scared, really scared, probably for the first time in his adult life. Every time he looked out his window and saw my beehives, he was reminded that his life was now governed by the whims of insects. He tried going to the county officials to complain about my beekeeping operation, but they informed him that I wasn't violating any zoning laws or agricultural regulations. As long as I kept the hives on my own property and maintained them properly, there was nothing they could do. He consulted with a lawyer about the possibility of a lawsuit, but was told that proving I had intentionally created a dangerous situation would be nearly impossible. After all, I was just a farmer expanding his legitimate agricultural business. The weekly ambulance calls continued throughout the summer. July was particularly bad because that's when a lot of wildflowers are in bloom, which meant my bees were at their most active. David couldn't walk to his mailbox without encountering them. He couldn't work in his garden, couldn't wash his truck in the driveway, couldn't even sit on his own front porch without constantly watching for approaching bees. Linda started talking about moving. I heard through the local gossip network that she'd been looking at houses in town, away from the rural area where they'd lived for their entire marriage. The stress was taking a toll on their relationship too. It's hard to maintain a normal life when one partner is essentially trapped inside their own home. David tried wearing a beekeeper's suit whenever he had to go outside, but the protective gear was hot and cumbersome, especially in the brutal Texas summer heat. Plus, the bees seemed to be able to find every tiny gap in the suit's defenses. Even the smallest opening at the wrist or ankle was enough for a determined bee to find its way inside. But the breaking point came in early September. It was Labor Day weekend, and David's grown children had come to visit with their families. I watched from my porch as they unloaded suitcases and coolers from their cars, probably planning to have a nice family barbecue and let the grandchildren play in the backyard. That lasted about an hour. The screaming started around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. David's daughter-in-law came running out of the backyard with her 4-year-old son in her arms, both of them crying. The little boy had been playing on the swing set when he was stung by one of my bees. Now, a bee sting isn't usually a big deal for a healthy child, but David's family was taking no chances. They loaded everyone into their cars and drove to the emergency room, leaving David and Linda alone in their house once again. That evening, I saw David standing at his kitchen window, looking out at my beehives with an expression I recognized. It was the same look a defeated man gets when he realizes he's fighting a battle he can't win. The for sale sign appeared in David's yard the next morning. Within a week, there was a steady stream of real estate agents, potential buyers, and home inspectors traipsing through David's property. Most of the viewings ended quickly when the visitors encountered my bees. Word was spreading through the local real estate market that the Miller place came with a unique set of challenges. The house finally sold in late September to a young couple from Houston who got it for about $15,000 below asking price. The buyers were both allergic to bee stings too, as it turned out, but they planned to demolish the existing house and build a new one farther back on the lot, away from the property line where my hives were located. David and Linda's moving truck arrived on a crisp October morning. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come. I was sitting on my front porch with my morning coffee, watching the movers load furniture and boxes into their truck, when David walked over to my fence line. He looked older than his 45 years, with new lines around his eyes and a defeated slump to his shoulders that hadn't been there a year ago. "You won," he said simply, without any preamble or small talk. I didn't say anything, just took another sip of my coffee and waited for him to continue. "I know what you did and I know why you did it," he went on. "Maybe I even deserved it. But I want you to know that Julia never, It was just that one time, Roger. One stupid moment that got out of hand. I still didn't respond. What was there to say? Whether it was once or 100 times didn't change the fact that he'd betrayed my trust and destroyed my marriage. I'm moving to Houston, he said. Got a job with my brother-in-law's construction company. Linda's excited about being closer to her sister, and we'll be far enough away that we won't have to worry about this. He gestured toward my beehives, which were humming peacefully in the morning sun. I hope you can find some peace, Roger. I really do. Then he turned and walked back to his house to finish packing. But my story was far from over. With David gone, my beekeeping operation settled into a profitable routine. 220 hives produce a tremendous amount of honey. I was harvesting over 6,000 pounds per year, which translated to significant income when sold at farmers markets and through online sales. I registered my business as Roger's Golden Honey, and started developing a reputation throughout East Texas for producing some of the finest wildflower honey in the region. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's betrayal had inadvertently launched me into one of the most successful business ventures of my life. Meanwhile, my marriage to Julia was disintegrating day by day. She tried everything she could think of to repair the damage. She suggested marriage counseling, which I refused. She offered to write David a letter telling him never to contact her again, as if that would somehow undo what had already been done. She even proposed that we take that vacation to see Sarah and the grandchildren in Dallas, thinking a change of scenery might help us reconnect. But I was past the point of wanting to reconnect. The trust was gone, and without trust, what's left of a marriage? The final confrontation came just before Christmas. Julia had been trying to pretend that things were getting back to normal between us, but we both knew it was just an act. We were like two strangers sharing the same house, going through the motions of a relationship that had died the day I saw her in David Miller's arms. She was decorating the Christmas tree in the living room, hanging ornaments that represented 35 years of shared memories, our children's handmade decorations from elementary school, souvenirs from the few vacations we'd taken over the years, and the angel that had been her grandmother's. Roger, she said without looking at me, we can't keep living like this. Either we try to work things out or what? I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. Or we get divorced. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had already burned everything down. I looked at the Christmas tree with its twinkling lights and familiar ornaments, and realized that this would probably be the last Christmas we'd spend in this house together. Fine, I said. We'll get divorced. The relief in her voice was unmistakable when she replied, okay. I'll call a lawyer after the holidays. But there was one more twist to this story. The divorce proceedings took about 6 months to complete. Texas is a community property state, which meant that Julia was entitled to half of everything we'd accumulated during our marriage. The house, the savings accounts, the farm equipment, even half the value of my expanded beekeeping operation. But Julia was terrified of bees, always had been, even before my revenge campaign against David, so she wanted nothing to do with the hives themselves. She was happy to take her share of the money and let me keep the actual bees. We sold the farmhouse and split the proceeds. Julia moved to an apartment in town, close enough to still see our children and grandchildren regularly but far enough away that we didn't have to run into each other at the grocery store or post office. I bought a smaller farm about 20 miles away and moved all my beehives to the new location. The change of scenery seemed to agree with the bees, and honey production actually increased in the new location. Roger's Golden Honey continued to grow as a business. I started selling at farmers markets in 3 counties, developed a website for online sales, and even got a contract to supply honey to a regional chain of health food stores. The kids adjusted to the new reality of their parents' divorce better than I'd expected. They maintained relationships with both Julia and me, though I could tell they were disappointed that we hadn't been able to work things out. The grandchildren were too young to really understand what had happened, which was probably for the best. But the real vindication came about a year after the divorce was finalized. I was at the farmer's market in the county seat, selling honey and talking to customers about the different varieties I produced, when I overheard 2 women discussing David Miller's situation. Apparently he and Linda had divorced too, about 6 months after they moved to Houston. The stress of the move, the financial losses from having to sell their house below market value, and the lingering effects of what had happened had finally destroyed their marriage as well. Linda had gotten tired of living with a man who jumped at shadows and saw threats in every flying insect. So in the end, David's moment of weakness with my wife had cost him his home, his marriage, his health, and his peace of mind. I couldn't have asked for more complete justice if I'd planned it myself. As for Julia, I heard through our children that she was doing well in town. She'd gotten a part-time job at the library and had joined a book club. She seemed to be building a new life for herself, one that didn't include romantic entanglements or beer-related drama. And me? I was doing better than I'd done in years. Running a successful honey business turned out to be incredibly rewarding, both financially and personally. There's something deeply satisfying about working with bees. They're honest, hard-working creatures that don't lie, cheat, or betray your trust. They just do their job day after day, producing something sweet and valuable. My typical day started before dawn, checking on the hives and making sure all the colonies were healthy and productive. I'd learned more about bee behavior and hive management in 2 years than I'd thought possible, and I developed a real appreciation for the complex social structure of these amazing insects. The financial success was gratifying too. What had started as an act of revenge had become a legitimate business that was earning more money than our old farming operation ever had. I was able to pay off the mortgage on my new farm in just 18 months and still had enough left over to expand the operation even further. But more than the money or even the satisfaction of seeing David Miller get his comeuppance, I'd found a new sense of purpose. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that was entirely my own, something that didn't depend on anyone else's loyalty or faithfulness. The bees didn't care about my age, my failed marriage, or my desire for revenge. They just cared about having a beekeeper who understood their needs and respected their role in the natural order of things. On quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch of my new farmhouse and listen to the gentle humming of my hives in the distance. It was a peaceful sound, nothing like the angry buzzing that had terrorized David Miller for months. These bees were content, productive, and focused on their work. Sometimes I'd think about the chain of events that had brought me to this point. If Julia hadn't betrayed me, I never would have expanded my beekeeping operation. If David hadn't been allergic to bee stings, my revenge wouldn't have been nearly as effective. If the divorce hadn't forced me to start over, I might never have discovered how much I enjoyed running my own business. In a strange way, their betrayal had been the best thing that ever happened to me. The final chapter of this story came 2 years later. I was at the State Fair in Dallas, where Roger's Golden Honey had won first place in the wildflower honey competition for the 2nd year running, when I ran into Julia. She was there with Sarah and the grandchildren, enjoying a family outing on a beautiful October afternoon. We both froze for a moment when we saw each other, neither sure how to handle this unexpected encounter. It had been almost 3 years since our divorce was finalized, and this was the first time we'd been face to face since then. "Hello, Roger," she said quietly, her voice carrying a mix of sadness and something that might have been regret. "Julia," I replied with a polite nod. The grandchildren, now old enough to remember me but young enough not to fully understand why Grandma and Grandpa didn't live together anymore, ran over to give me hugs. Sarah followed behind them, looking slightly uncomfortable but trying to keep things normal for the kids' sake. "Congratulations on the award," Julia said, gesturing toward the blue ribbon display at my honey booth. "Sarah told me your business has been doing really well." "It has," I confirmed. "Turns out I have a knack for beekeeping." We made small talk for a few more minutes, the kind of careful, polite conversation that divorced couples have when they run into each other in public. She looked older, with more gray in her hair and new lines around her eyes, but she also looked lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I hope you're happy, Roger," she said finally, and I could tell she meant it. "I know I hurt you terribly and I know you'll probably never forgive me for that. But I hope you found some peace." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had shared most of my adult life and then destroyed it with one moment of weakness. The anger that had consumed me for so long was still there, but it felt distant now, like a fire that had burned down to cold ashes. "I have found peace," I told her. "Just not the kind I expected to find." She smiled sadly and nodded. Then she gathered up the grandchildren and walked away with Sarah, disappearing into the crowd of fairgoers. That night, as I drove home to my farm and my bees, I realized that my story of revenge had become something else entirely. It had become a story of redemption, of starting over, of discovering that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing that ever happened to you. David Miller had gotten what he deserved. Julia had gotten what she deserved. And I had gotten exactly what I needed, even though I hadn't known I needed it at the time. My bees were waiting for me when I got home, humming their eternal song in the darkness. 220 hives full of creatures that understood the value of hard work, loyalty, and producing something sweet from the raw materials life gives you. I sat on my porch and listened to them work, and for the first time in years I felt truly content. Justice had been served, not through violence or hatred, but through the simple, relentless persistence of nature itself. David Miller had learned that actions have consequences. Julia had learned that betrayal comes with a price. And I had learned that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply living well. As I looked out over my thriving beekeeping operation, with the lights of my honey processing facility glowing in the distance and the sound of success humming all around me, I couldn't help but smile. After all, revenge is a dish best served with honey. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Maybe YouTube will no longer offer you my channel, so subscribe to it by clicking subscribe on the right under the video to receive new interesting stories. Also on the right of the video there is a playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to, and you can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.